When we were first captured, none of us expected mercy. We had seen how prisoners were treated on the Eastern Front, and we assumed the Americans would be little different. We prepared ourselves for hunger, for humiliation, for endless hard labor. Instead, the strangest shock came not in the form of cruelty, but in the form of sweetness. It came in something we had not tasted since childhood, ice cream, and in bottles filled with a brown liquid we had only heard about in whispers, Coca-Cola. I was taken prisoner in North Africa in 1943. Alongside thousands of other Germans from the Afrika Korps, I was shipped across the Atlantic, crammed into the belly of a transport ship, seasick and bitter. When the hatches opened weeks later, I expected nothing more than barbed wire and barking guards. And yes, there were fences, towers, rifles. But there was also order. Barracks stood neat, latrines worked, water flowed. It was prison, but it was not chaos. In those first days, we ate from the mess hall like soldiers. The food was plain but filling. Bread, meat, vegetables. Many of us thought this was temporary, that the Americans would tighten the rations soon enough. Then, one hot afternoon in Texas, a surprise came. The guards told us to line up outside the mess. Trucks had arrived, and men unloaded crates filled with something we could not imagine. When the first spoonfuls were served, confusion rippled down the line. It was cold, creamy, sweet. Ice cream. I can still remember the first taste. It melted instantly on my tongue, sugary and rich, as though every bite was a dream. For months we had eaten little more than black bread and soup so thin you could see the bottom of the bowl. Now this? Men laughed, some even cried. One prisoner shook his head and muttered, "They give ice cream to their prisoners? Then what do their children eat?" As if that was not enough, within days, another marvel appeared. At first we thought it beer, served in glass bottles with metal caps. But the liquid inside was brown, fizzy, sweet, unlike anything we had known. Coca-Cola. Some had heard the name before, a drink said to be the taste of America, but none of us believed it was real. We passed bottles back and forth, sniffing, sipping, then drinking deep. It was refreshing, sharp, alive with bubbles. The Americans handed them out casually, as though they were nothing. For us, it was like being handed treasure. The strangeness of it gnawed at us. How could they spare such things for enemies? Ice cream required cold storage, sugar, milk, luxuries in a world at war. Coca-Cola required factories, bottling plants, distribution. Yet here we were, prisoners behind wire, sipping it freely. It felt like mockery, as if the Americans were showing us not just kindness, but superiority. To them, this was ordinary. To us, it was unimaginable. I remember one evening sitting on the barracks steps, a bottle of Coke in hand, staring at the bubbles rising. I thought of home, of my mother boiling potato peels for soup, of my sister queuing for bread. In Germany, children grew thinner each month. In America, even their prisoners grew fatter. The contrast was unbearable. Whispers spread among us. Some said it was propaganda, a trick to soften us. Others insisted it was real, a glimpse of the abundance that made America undefeatable. A sergeant near me spat in the dirt and muttered, "If they can waste this on us, then we have already lost." His words sank deep, for none of us could argue. The guards seemed amused at our astonishment. One explained that Coca-Cola was everywhere in America, sold on every street corner, delivered to every town. Another told us that ice cream was as common as bread, eaten by children after school. We stared at him in disbelief. The abundance was not a gift meant to impress us. It was simply life in their country. That realization cut sharper than any chain. We had fought, bled, starved, believing ourselves the strong ones, the chosen nation. Yet in captivity, with cones of ice cream melting in our hands and bottles of Coke sweating in the Texas sun, we realized that strength was not just soldiers and weapons, it was factories, farms, and a culture that could treat sweetness as ordinary. That night in the barracks, men whispered their disbelief. "Imagine," one said, "children eating ice cream every week." Another muttered, "If they live like this in war, how do they live in peace?" Silence followed. None of us could answer. It was then that I first understood the true meaning of defeat. It was not the fences or the guards. It was the simple fact that our enemy's abundance reached even us behind wire in the heart of a war. The first shock of tasting ice cream and Coca-Cola did not fade quickly. For weeks, the men in our camp spoke of little else. Even in the middle of work details, the conversation returned to it. Some prisoners described the texture of the ice cream in such detail you could almost taste it again. Others held on to the memory of the bubbles fizzing against their tongues. It was as if these small luxuries had shaken us more than bullets or bombs ever had. At first we thought it had been a one-time gesture, something arranged for propaganda, a way to break our spirits or convince us of American generosity. But then the deliveries continued. Every few weeks, trucks arrived with more crates of bottled Coca-Cola. The mess hall served ice cream on Sundays, not as a holiday, but as if it were routine. The shock deepened. For Americans, this was ordinary life. For us, it felt unreal. One guard, a young man from Kansas, overheard us whispering and laughed. "You fellows look at Coke like it's gold," he said. "Back home, my little brother drinks one every day after school." We stared at him in silence, unable to believe such waste was possible. In Germany, children ate boiled turnips for dinner. Here they drank sugar in bottles as if it were water. The guard wasn't mocking us, he was simply stating a fact. And somehow, that made it worse. The officers in camp tried to discourage talk of abundance. They reminded us that our duty was still to Germany, that captivity did not mean surrender. Yet in the barracks, late at night, the whispers continued. Some men argued it was all a show, that the Americans wanted us to report back lies when the war ended. But the more we saw, the harder that was to believe. A group of prisoners was assigned to work in town under guard. When they returned, their stories silenced all doubts. They had seen American children walking home from school with Coca-Cola bottles in their hands. They had watched housewives in shops buying cartons of ice cream without hesitation. One man said bitterly, "Even their children live better than our officers." No one contradicted him. The truth had become undeniable. The humiliation was sharper than any punishment could have been. We were not treated cruelly, but we were reminded every day of the gap between what we thought was strength and what true power looked like. It was not only tanks or planes, it was the fact that in the middle of a global war, America still had enough to give its prisoners luxuries our civilians had not tasted in years. There were moments when the sweetness itself felt like mockery. I remember holding a cone of vanilla ice cream one sweltering afternoon, the cold dripping down my fingers and feeling almost sick with shame. How could I enjoy this while my family in Germany searched rubble for potatoes? How could this be my life, a prisoner eating better than free men back home? The guilt was unbearable, yet I still ate every bite. Hunger does not argue with pride. Over time, some men began to embrace these gifts. They looked forward to the next delivery, trading chores for an extra bottle of Coke, hoarding caps as souvenirs. Others grew bitter, refusing to touch what they saw as enemy propaganda. But even those who turned away could not deny the truth. The Americans had abundance beyond measure. I often sat outside the barracks at dusk, watching guards drink Coca-Cola casually, tossing empty bottles aside as if they meant nothing. Each one was a symbol. To them it was refreshment. To me it was proof that we were fighting a war we could never win. One day, during a break on a work detail, a guard handed me a bottle directly. He smiled, perhaps out of pity, and said, "Here, you look thirsty." I took it, reluctant, but when I drank, the sweetness filled me with a strange mixture of gratitude and despair. Gratitude because he treated me as human. Despair because this small gesture carried the weight of a nation's strength, They could afford to be generous. We could not. The younger prisoners were especially shaken. Many had grown up in Hitler Youth, taught that Germany was destined to rule, that Americans were weak and decadent. Now they sat behind wire, sipping Coca-Cola and licking ice cream cones, realizing that the world they had been promised was a lie. One of them confessed to me quietly, "If this is how they treat prisoners, then I cannot imagine how they treat their own." His voice trembled, not with fear, but with awakening. It was not only the luxuries themselves, but the casual way they appeared. Ice cream was not rare. Coca-Cola was not reserved for holidays. They were everyday indulgences in a land so rich it could drown in sugar and still have more. That realization was perhaps the greatest defeat of all. By late summer, the Americans arranged what they called an ice cream social for prisoners. Tables were set in the camp yard, tubs of ice cream laid out in rows. Guards served scoops while music played from a gramophone. For them, it was nothing unusual, just another Sunday. For us, it was surreal. Grown men who had once marched through Europe, proud and ruthless, now stood in line for scoops of chocolate and vanilla, silent and humbled. I remember one comrade biting into his cone and whispering, "This is the taste of our defeat." I wanted to argue, but I could not. He was right. It was not bombs or bullets that had broken us. It was the realization that the enemy had so much they could give even sweetness to those they had captured. That night, in the barracks, the men were quieter than usual. The sweetness lingered on our tongues, but so did the bitterness of realization. We had once laughed at the idea of American weakness. Now we understood. Strength was not only measured in weapons, it was measured in the ordinary, in the luxuries so common they became invisible. For us, those luxuries were shocking. For America, they were life itself. The war ended, but the memory of ice cream and Coca-Cola never left us. For months after Germany's surrender, we remained in the camps, still behind wire, still waiting for repatriation. The routine continued. Roll calls, work details, mess hall meals. Yet the shock of abundance had already done its work. None of us looked at the world the same way again. Letters trickled through from home, carried by the Red Cross. They spoke of ruins, of hunger, of families searching the countryside for food. One comrade read his mother's words aloud. "We eat turnip bread and acorn coffee. The children cry themselves to sleep." His voice broke, and in silence we passed around bottles of Coca-Cola, cold against our palms. The guilt was unbearable. We drank sweetness while our families starved. Some refused to touch it after that, pushing their bottles aside, ashamed. But others clung to it desperately, as though each sip was proof that life could be better, that somewhere in the world, normalcy still existed. When men returned from work details in American towns, their stories deepened the wound. They spoke of grocery stores filled with food, shelves stacked with cartons of ice cream, crates of Coca-Cola piled high, all sold cheaply, all bought casually. One man swore he had seen a boy drop a bottle, watch it shatter, and walk away unconcerned. The thought tormented him. In Germany, such a bottle would have been guarded like treasure. Here, it was nothing. The Americans never understood the effect it had on us. For them, handing out ice cream and Coke was kindness, perhaps even boredom relief. For us, it was revelation. It showed us a nation so rich that its prisoners lived better than our free civilians. It showed us that power was not just tanks and planes, but a way of life that flowed with sugar, cold drinks, and simple luxuries even in the middle of war. As months passed, some prisoners began to dream aloud of staying in America. They spoke of factories, of farms, of the lives they glimpsed beyond the wire. "If this is how they live in war," one man whispered, "then in peace it must be paradise." The guards laughed when they heard such talk, but to us it was no joke. We had seen enough to believe it. When repatriation finally came, many of us felt dread instead of joy. We boarded ships eastward, hearts heavy. The return to Germany was no homecoming. Cities lay in rubble, children begged in the streets, and food was measured in rations that barely kept us alive. Families listened with disbelief when we told them that American prisoners ate ice cream and drank Coca-Cola. Some accused us of lying, thinking we had been seduced by propaganda. But others saw the truth in our eyes. We had no need to invent such stories. For me, the memory of that first scoop of vanilla never faded. I could still feel the shock of cold, the sweetness flooding my mouth, the disbelief that such a thing could be handed freely to a prisoner. I told my children years later that this was when I knew Germany had lost. Not because of a single battle, not because of one defeat, but because our enemy's ordinary was stronger than our extraordinary. I kept a Coca-Cola cap as a souvenir, hidden in my belongings. It was small, trivial, but to me it was a symbol. A reminder of how the war had truly been decided, not only by weapons, but by the simple, unstoppable weight of abundance. We had fought for a dream of dominance, yet behind wire we tasted the reality of defeat, sweet and cold on our tongues. Even now, as an old man, when I see a bottle of Coca-Cola or taste ice cream on a hot day, I am carried back to that camp in Texas. I see the faces of my comrades, stunned into silence by luxuries we had not imagined possible. I hear the guard laughing softly as he tells us his brother drinks one every day after school. I feel the humiliation and the strange gratitude tangled together in my chest. We could not believe it then, and in some ways I still cannot believe it now. But it was real. America's victory was not only fought with tanks and planes, it was fought with sugar, with ice, with bottles of fizzing sweetness. It was fought with the ability to give prisoners what our own families lacked. That was the true measure of power, and it is why we were doomed from the start.